Good afternoon or morning or evening or some other time of the day. Wherever you are watching this live, you have come across GeoStrata Extra, and we are happy that you did. My name is Brad Keeler. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute. If you are not familiar with the Geo-Institute, we are one of 9 technical institutes within the American Society of Civil Engineers. We have about 12,000 members, most of whom are geotechnical engineers or geologists, maybe both, could be neither, but usually it's one or the other. This is the 7th installment of GeoStrata Extra. I will tell you a little bit about that. Every issue of GeoStrata that comes out, which is our member magazine that is issued 6 times per year, we do an in-depth interview with one of the authors from that issue. Sometimes, if we are feeling generous, and we usually are, we do a bonus GeoStrata Extra, which is the case today. We had an article from one of last year's issues that was so cool, we thought we should bring you some more about it. This is our special Memorial Day edition of GeoStrata Extra. For those of you outside the US, Memorial Day is the last Monday every May, and we use it as a day to honor our fallen soldiers, those who have served throughout the history of this country. We also use it to honor our current soldiers and our living veterans. So we are very happy to have with us today Jeff Dunn, one of our stalwart GeoStrata editors. He will be interviewing Bill Lawson of Texas Tech University about his article from the March-April GeoStrata from 2020 about the soil mechanics, the geotechnics of the beach in France on the day of the D-Day invasion. That was a lot of words. I think they all came out in the right order. And thank you guys both for being with us today and for doing this. At this point, Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Brad. And as Brad said, I'm going to be talking to Professor William Bill Lawson, and we're going to be talking some more about his articles, the formal name of which is Soil Sampling at Sword Beach in Normandy, France, 1943. Which was published in the 20th anniversary issue just over a year ago. Brad mentioned my name. I'm Jeff Dunn, your host, and we'll be talking with Bill. And I'm a senior principal and senior consultant with our Jeffrey Dunn Geotechnical Consulting in Walnut Creek near San Francisco. And I've been an editor on GeoStrata magazine since 2004, which I've greatly enjoyed doing and continue to do. As for our author today, Bill Lawson, is mentioned by Brad as a professor of civil engineering at Texas Tech University. He's recently become a diplomate of geotechnical engineering, and congratulations to you, Bill, on that, and a member of ASCE, of course. His career in higher education is a little different than some geotechnical engineers, but it's characterized by excellence and innovation in teaching and award-winning scholarship and sponsored research and professional service, not unlike a lot of folks in academics, but his creative activities encompass both technical research on geotechnical applications in transportation, but interdisciplinary study of professionalism, ethics, and trust and trustworthiness in professional client relationships, a very, very strong aspect of the geotechnical engineering community. He's a licensed professional engineer and has been for over 35 years and has 35 years experience in engineering education and consulting practice, and has provided project management, technical oversight for geotechnical construction, materials, transportation, environmental, and facilities projects nationwide. So a little background on our author there. Just some introductory comments from myself before we get into the question and answer. As I mentioned, I've been an editor of GeoStrata now for quite a number of years, and I've worked with a wide range of authors on articles covering a wide variety of mostly technical subjects. But I've had to say that in editing and reading articles in the magazine, that those that deal with some historic aspect of geotechnology are often the most enjoyable for me to either work on the editing of or to read as you do when you receive your issue. And that may be a bias because my father happened to be a history professor at a junior college. And while I wanted to be an engineer from a young age, he made sure I developed a appreciation for history, although I sometimes rebelled against it in my youth. When I grew up in the 1950s and 60s in a neighborhood in Los Angeles, it was just full of World War II veterans from all branches of the armed forces. There were bomber pilots, Navy sailors, infantrymen, and all kinds of things in our neighborhood. And I heard stories from my father, who, even though he was a historian, not an engineer, served in a Corps of Engineers combat bridge building battalion in Europe that landed on Omaha Beach just days after D-Day. This background helped spur a visit by my wife and myself to the D-Day beaches and to the Normandy area just after the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings in 1984. And I've read many, many accounts of World War II, including one book mentioned in this article, but somehow I missed or I forgot, which almost sounds embarrassing, about this important aspect of soil sampling, the importance it played in D-Day and how it was carried out, which is a fascinating story. But after reading this article, I don't think I'm going to forget it again, especially with some of the backstory behind the article, which Bill and I will be discussing today. One comment before we start into the questions. During the interview, if you have questions for Professor Lawson, please type them into the comments for this video feed while you watch, and we'll do our best to address them as time allows. We might combine them in with some other questions, so you might not hear your question spoken exactly as you wrote it, but we'll cover as many as we can. So with those introductory comments, welcome Bill to GeoStrata Extra. As you know, and has been mentioned by Brad Keeler already, today's interview recognizes Memorial Day this coming Monday, and we'll be discussing your article about the geotechnical engineering aspects associated with the D-Day invasion on the coast of Normandy in June 1944. I'm interested in, how did you come to write this article? Are you from a military family that gave you interest in that? Or?
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. Actually, no, I am not from a military family in the traditional sense. My father was a water well driller, my mother a homemaker, and my brothers and sisters and I grew up on a ranch in Central Texas. For my part, I graduated from high school shortly after the close of the Vietnam War. And while I was required to register for the draft, by the time I reached the age for military service, the Lawson family is a traditional and a patriotic family. My brothers and sisters and I were raised that way. My father served in the Army in the 1950s during the time between World War II and the Korean conflict. His father, my grandfather, served during active combat duty in World War I in the Battle of Belleau Wood, among others. Before them, several of our ancestors served in the Civil War, and one of my wife's ancestors was an officer in the War of 1812, believe it or not. And so there's a military background back there, but we're not a traditional military family.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Certainly a lot of ties to the military in your family, though, extending back several generations, or many generations, I guess. So how and when did you come to write the D-Day article?
Well, it begins with the fact that perhaps like you, I'm an avid history buff. And here I'm going to ask you to go ahead and put up image 1, which is a classic photo of General Eisenhower talking with paratroopers from the 101st Airborne on June 5, the day before the D-Day invasion. Many in our audience know that in 1998, DreamWorks Pictures released Steven Spielberg's epic war film, Saving Private Ryan. I saw that film and I was deeply moved by it, and I recall talking with my family about this. Not too long after that, on the occasion of my birthday, my mom gifted me with Stephen Ambrose's book, D-Day, The Climactic Battle of World War II. And in reading that book, I was surprised to learn, thank you, that the real story behind Saving Private Ryan consisted of one brief paragraph in Ambrose's 650-page book. And those of you who have seen that film know that it's a 3-hour film, and he got that out of one paragraph. Okay, so that's amazing. It's an amazing story. But for the purpose of our conversation today, the thing that's most significant, and this is really going toward how I came to write this story, was that I read for the first time in Ambrose's book about the covert soil sampling operations that British Special Forces conducted on Normandy beaches in preparation for the D-Day invasion. Ambrose actually devotes a couple of pages to this, and it's an amazing story. And so that's kind of what got it started.
Okay. Well, I remember reading that book as well, and in fact, it's only a few feet away on my bookshelf. One that's I haven't read for a few years, but I knew right where to put my hands on it. But that makes me think how in geotechnical investigations, we often consider the history of a site, and particularly the geologic evolution of a site in a longer historical context. But how often do we, even as geotechnical engineers and geologists, call it history in the same sense? So how did this story make it into GeoStrata magazine?
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you. Well, so before the story made it in GeoStrata magazine, I'd actually published this account in the the proceedings of the 6th International Conference on Case Histories in Geotechnical Engineering, which was convened in Arlington, Virginia in 2008. That was on the knowledge that I had learned from reading the Ambrose book and several other sources, and also the many wonderful experiences I had with students who just loved hearing about this story. And so GeoStrata's editor, and that's a great image, that's the 20th anniversary edition of the GeoStrata magazine. GeoStrata's editor, Dr. Jim Withiam, was the one who really encouraged me to edit and adapt my former conference proceeding paper to GeoStrata. I had, actually this was in June 2019, I requested and received permission to share the Case Histories paper with the USugar community. This is a community of geotechnical engineering practitioners and educators. And then when that went out, Dr. Withiam read that, and then he immediately reached out to me and said, hey, this would be a good fit for GeoStrata. Can you edit and adapt it? And with the permission and thanks to the folks at Missouri University of Science and Technology and their permission, yes, I could, and I did. And so Jim was very persuasive, very helpful in all things, and of course I was very enthusiastic about it. As I mentioned in an earlier conversation we had, it was kind of like collar and sick'em to a guard dog. This was not hard to get me in, okay? And I will say that of the scores of conference and journal papers I've authored, from the hundreds of geotechnical reports I've written, from the thousands of pages of research reports I've written, this D-Day story is hands down the favorite of them all. And so I just dove headfirst in this amazing experience, which has turned out to be a highlight of my career, and I'm very grateful for that.
Well, thank you for that background story, Bill.
Sure.
The story is fascinating, but the geotechnical part of it, what was it that really kind of caught your eye? Was maybe, I don't know, the driver for doing the work to put this together? Because it certainly seems like you put in a lot of effort for the article.
Sure. So I would say many things, actually. I want to, just to start, and no reason to not mention the obvious, this is a direct, and I underscore direct, application of geotechnical engineering to the climactic battle of World War II. Okay, that's a big deal. It's played out on the world stage. The success of the D-Day invasion is what we're talking about. That's what's at stake here. Soldiers' lives are at stake here. It would not be overreach to say that the fate of democracy, if not the course of modern history, depended on the outcome of this invasion. And so the significance, the stakes of this particular issue couldn't be any higher than they were. And this is geotechnical engineering This is soil sampling. This is something that as geotechnical engineers, you and I and hundreds, if not thousands around the world every day do this. They do this kind of thing. But in this case, it's lifted up to the world level on this stage that's just truly amazing. And so first and foremost, I think it's reasonable to say that just completely gripped my attention when I read that story in Ambrose's book.
Well, that's understandable. I mean, reading your articles, it reminded me of walking on Omaha Beach back in 1984. And I remember very distinctly the sand seemed pretty firm, but
okay.
I also now think of, if it wasn't, what a disaster it could have been, and a totally different outcome on D-Day, or at least a very different one, maybe if not totally different.
Right.
So that the wartime application of soil mechanics is of course interesting. What else about the story caught your attention?
Well, in the same way that a feature film has starring characters, but also many supporting actors and actresses, this story has got an amazing, truly amazing cast of characters. And I'd actually like to have you go to image set 4, and we'll share a series of images of some of these people. And so we want to begin with the principals in our story, the lead, the stars of the show, so to speak. This is an image of Major Logan Scott Bowden, who was 24 years old when this happened. And then the next image is Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith. These were heroic, disciplined, and determined individuals. And this story is truly their story. And here I just want to mention to you, Jeff, and to all of us that before our conversation today, I reached out to the children of Major General Logan Scott Bowden. And some of those, I believe, are listening in on our conversation today, and also to the grandchildren of Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, and I believe they may be on the call today as well. And so thank you for being here, and thank you for for your encouragement to me and the way you helped me with writing the paper. And I'm just so glad you're here, and I hope that this is it truly honors all that your grandfather and your father did. Thank you. There are others besides Major Logan Scott Bowden. He was a major at the time, and then Sergeant Smith. The next image, it didn't stop there. This story tells the origins of what we know today as special forces warfare. We hear about this a lot nowadays, but this is where it began, or these are the roots of it. This occurred under the vision and leadership of the person showing here, Lieutenant Commander Nigel Clogstown Wilmot of the British Royal Navy. He was the founder of Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, referred to as COP, the acronym COP, that undertook the covert beach reconnaissance that we're talking about. Next slide, please. This directly involved multiple generals. I showed you earlier a picture of President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower at the time. This is General Omar Bradley, who was the principal American ground commander for our forces. General Bradley eventually was promoted to the General of the Army, the last individual to hold a 5-star rank, and ultimately became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he was directly hands-on involved in this. So General Bradley, next slide, please. Because this was an amphibious operation, not just a ground operation, it did involve the Navy, it involved admirals. Here is an image of Admiral Bertram Ramsay of the British Royal Navy, who not only was responsible for the planning and the commanding of naval forces for Operation Overlord of the D-Day invasion, but also was responsible for the Dunkirk evacuation. Many of us would know about that. Next slide, please. An image of the King of England, George VI, the father of our Queen Elizabeth. Perhaps you recall the film The King's Speech, which was about him. He served in both the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force and became known as the symbol of British determination to win the war. He also features in this story. And so the King of England, George VI. Next slide, please. This is Prime Minister Churchill's science advisor, Professor John Bernal, a Cambridge grad. He's a crystallographer and one of the founding fathers of molecular biology. But by virtue of his research in English laboratories or libraries, he was responsible for the detailed mapping of the Normandy beaches. And he also was the person who instructed our two commanders, Logan Scott Bowden and Bruce Ogden Smith, in stealth-based soil sampling techniques and practice. He also was a principal designer for the Mulberry Harbors. Some of you are aware of that and how that featured in the D-Day invasion as well. That's a whole nother story, but this person right here was involved in all that. So what an amazing set. And then I had included one more. This is an image of Sir Malcolm Campbell. He held the world speed record for both land and water in the 1920s and 1930s. He was the first person to travel more than 300 miles per hour in a vehicle. He did this on beach flats, Daytona Beach and all over the world, really. And in support of that effort, he had worked out the functional requirement for beach sand support of a heavy vehicle, such as the ones he would race, that it required 14 inches of compacted beach sand. And so he developed a penetration test type device to confirm this, and he would use that before he would race to make sure that the sand was adequate support. For those, many of us are geotechnical engineers on this audience, we would know of this or think of this as like a portable SPT hammer. This was, of course, a very noisy impact type device, and it was not suitable for stealth type operations such as our commandos used. And so one of the things that Professor Bernal in the previous image had to do was to convert that device so that they could obtain samples, but in a quiet and stealthy way, because they were doing this behind enemy lines under cover of darkness. So truly amazing cast of characters that were involved in this. And these are just some of them. There are others as well.
What you mentioned, I think also that you had some incredible experiences just tracking down these photos for the article. And I know from experience that sometimes research can be somewhat of an adventure, and you'll find things, places you don't expect, to make connections you never thought might occur. Could you speak a little bit about that too?
Sure. I'll take you through some of the images in the article. So we'll go to the next slide, please. This is an image of the Saving Private Ryan poster. Those of you who have read the article know this picture is not in there. And the reason is that the American Society of Civil Engineers is extremely careful about its image permission documentation. And I couldn't get permission to use this. With considerable effort, I was able to track down the cognizant office from Paramount Pictures who held the authority to say yes or no, and they said no to permission for this. They said, though, but because this was an educational application for use of the picture, that I could use the picture without objection. So it wasn't with permission, it was without objection. I've often thought of that, how clever that attorney was, but he was firm in his resolve that no, I could not have permission. And that wasn't, without objection wasn't good enough for ASCE. And so I didn't get to use it, but it was really interesting to kind of chase that down and to learn a little bit about all of that. The next image, please. This is the opening picture in the GEOSTRATA article. It's entitled Into the Jaws of Death. It was taken by Chief Photographer's Mate Robert F. Sargent of the U.S. Coast Guard on the morning of June 6, 1944. It's in real time. It's an iconic photo of the D-Day invasion. This is actually held by the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration in Maryland, in the D.C. metro area. And this is a part of that collection. Truly, they have a group of people, and they were very professional, very great to work with. And so I got a chance to visit with them and was able to get permission to use this one. This is a really amazing photo. Next slide, please. In contrast to the ease with which I was able to get the previous photo, I thought I was never going to get this photo. I hired 2 archivists to help me run it down. And the way they described it to me was that after World War II was over, they said, well, we got to pack up, boys, and go home. And so they put it all in a box and they haul it over to across the ocean back to the United States, and they put it in a warehouse somewhere, and all these boxes exist, and they kind of divided them up. And the belief was that this was held by the cartographic branch. And so I hired one, and then one helped me because she was just generous and she believed in what I was doing and she wanted this story to be told. And ultimately they found out that this story wasn't held by the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration. It was held by the U.S. military. One second here, I've got it written down. U.S. Army Center for Military History. And so, but they were able to help me track that down. And once I learned that, then I was able to reach out to U.S. Center for Military History, and they were graciously offered permission for us to use it. One thing I want to mention is that this image actually does point out a very significant thing: why D-Day, why the Normandy, or not why D-Day, but why the Normandy beaches. The Normandy beaches are showing in the sort of flat area where all the words are down there, where Jeff has his cursor. That's about 100 miles if you go from there due north to the southern shore of the United Kingdom. Whereas over to the right, you can see that there's the cliffs of Dover and there's Calais, the French town of Calais. That's only about 20 miles, so it's just a lot closer. But of course, everybody expected the invasion there, and the reinforcements and the armaments and things that German forces had erected to protect that were formidable there. And so D-Day was kind of like Plan B. And so they made that 100-mile trek or sail across the English Channel to land on D-Day. This shows that general area. The next image was part of that same set, again from the U.S. Center for Military History, showing the actual D-Day beaches, all of them that are heroes, Major Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, Nigel Clogston Wilman, and others of the COP group. They did reconnaissance among all these beaches, not just Sword Beach, which is what I titled my article, but also Juneau, Gold, Omaha, and Utah. So they actually threw a variety of craft. So this one, when I actually was again despairing that I was ever going to get to use this image because I never could find who owned it and to get permission for it. But one of the happy things that occurred because of this was I discovered that in the Library of Congress, there is a collection now declassified of cartographic materials, including maps of the D-Day invasion. And those were prepared by the, let's see, again, I wrote this down, the engineer section of the 12th Army Group. And these are publicly available for us. And they actually show the progress of the D-Day invasion in about 6-hour increments from the beginning through the first week or two when it moved farther inland. But those images were available. And so if this wasn't available, I had a really solid backup. But for those of you who are really just geeking out on this and say, hey, I want to learn more about it, the Library of Congress has some really cool maps that show the progress of all the forces during this invasion. If you could go to the next slide, please. This is an image of the X-Craft midget submarine HMS Extant. This was used, I believe that's actually in the background by what I would call the conning tower. I don't know that's what it is. I believe that's Lieutenant Commander Nigel Clogstown Wilmot on this image. This was the sea trials that they did in Holy Loch in Scotland in the Firth of Clyde using this miniature submarine. It's a very cool thing that these coppists performed their reconnaissance using a variety of craft. In some cases, along the D-Day shores, they used these craft and they would go for protect extended periods of time under battery power, and they would do their reconnaissance. They also used a number of boats, very quiet, low, no wake, stealthy boats, canoes. They had special made boats for this. And so there were a number of fascinating things associated with how these commandos actually went ashore under cover of darkness and stealth to gather the information that was necessary to support a beach invasion. Thank you.
Wow, though just the background research, that sounds well like a lot of work, of course, but also very, very interesting, probably satisfying, particularly since you were able to come up with a good range of maps and images. What else can you tell us, or what can you tell us about the principles of the D-Day sampling operation, the two men, Major Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, that actually came ashore and did the soil sampling? Sure.
So, well, I'd be honored to talk about that. And I have a series of images here. This is Logan Scott Bowden as a young man. As you know, he's a hero. He received military honors, medals decorated by the king. I've corresponded with several of his children. He had 6 children, and I've read quite a bit about him. And so what I'll do is tell you a little bit about Logan Scott Bowden. I initially learned not about him from this way, but to actually do my research, the primary source of research was by way of New Zealand, believe it or not, where I interacted with a genealogist who had compiled directories of English nobility, and Logan Scott Bowden is in one of those directories, as is his son. He was born in Whitehaven, Cumbria, in the Lake District of Northwest England in February 1920. He was educated at Malvern College and the Royal Military Academy, where he had a reputation as an athlete and a swimmer. In fact, he was recruited because of that by Nigel Clogsdown Wilmot. Commander Wilmot had the knowledge and the interest, but his health didn't enable him to do these very strenuous things that Logan Scott Bowden and Bruce Ogden Smith could do. And so he was recruited in part because of that. He was commissioned in the Royal Engineers in 1939, and then he had a long and distinguished military career after that, including leading the 17th Field Company Royal Engineers across Northwest Europe in the close of World War II. After that, he was served in Singapore, Burma as Brigade Major of the 98th Indian Infantry Brigade, and in Palestine, Libya, and Korea until 1953. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in 1959 and promoted again throughout the ranks. He became a Major General in 1972, and he served as head of the British Defense Liaison Staff, New Delhi, India, until he retired in 1974. I might show the next image. This is Logan Scott Bowden from his military photo. Actually, this was featured in the Times of London in his obituary. The family, this was used in our article in GeoStrata by permission of Logan Scott Bowden's family. His daughter actually wrote to me a very kind note and gave me permission to use it. And a British, I think, again, I might say this wrong, and Ms. Bowden, if I do, forgive me, a gentleman in the true sense of the term. He married Jocelyn Rose Price in 1950. They were parents of 6 children, 3 sons, all of whom went into the military, and then also 3 daughters, 3 sons, 3 daughters. I'm from a family of 5. There are 5 Lawsons. His eldest son, Robert, served in the Royal Scots and retired as a brigadier. His son, James, served for 10 years in the Welsh Guards and then became an environmental engineer. His son, Peter, served with the 2nd Gurkha Rifles and is now the deputy director of the World Food Program in Islamabad. Their 3 daughters, the eldest daughter, Claire, with whom I corresponded last night, actually. She was an auctioneer secretary. Their daughter, Fiona, married a retired property developer, and their daughter, Alexandra, is married to an artist. After leaving the Army, after his retirement, Logan Scott Bowden, as a country gentleman, you could go to the next slide, please. He was invited, this is his general photo, very distinguished British officer. I mean, when I think of what I think of as a British military man, I'm looking at him right here. This is the image I have right here of the officer. Next image, please. He was invited in one of the earlier anniversaries of the D-Day invasion to travel back to the Normandy beaches and to kind of reenact how they did it. And so here is Major General Logan Scott Bowden, now retired, but reenacting those things. And then finally, the next slide, another slide of him as an older man. One of the things that he did was they recorded, kind of like we're recording an interview now, there were some recorded interviews of Major General Logan Scott Bowden where he would tell some of these stories, and I actually saw some of those on VHS cassette, believe it or not. And this was Major Logan Scott Bowden in his later years. After leaving the Army, he farmed cattle in Oxfordshire, sort of near the Cotswold region of southeast England, where he had a 20-acre holding in Elwelme. His family spent holidays in Italy. They camped in Bavaria and skied in Austria. His son, Robert, Robbie, so what he goes for, Brigadier General Robbie Logan Scott Bowden, described him as charismatic yet modest. He loved a glass of whiskey with friends and colleagues. He adored his family. A friend said he was strict and old-fashioned and expected his children to behave themselves. He mellowed in later years. He was one of the kindest people and interested in others, whoever they were. He died of old age in February 2014 at the age of 93. Logan Scott Bowden, one of our heroes. Thank you. Next slide, please. Or I think we're going to talk about the next person, Bruce Ogden Smith, his friend and his partner in these daring exploits, tales of daring do. So this is an image of Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith. Fewer than 200 men, mainly from the Royal Navy and the Royal Engineers, served in the COP, the Combined Operations Piloted Parties group, during the last 3 years of World War II. Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, showing here of the Special Boat Section under the auspices of the Royal Marines, was one of these men. As heroes go, he was low-key and his missions were top secret. He received 2 gallantry awards during the Second World War. He was initially drawn into the world of clandestine operations by his brother Colin. There were actually three brothers. His brother Colin was a special forces officer. He began as a member of the small-scale raiding force, and later, as we know, he became renowned for the clandestine beach reconnaissance work that he did with Major Logan Scott Bowden. He was born in April 1918 in Brentford, West London, England, near the confluence of the River Brent and the Thames. His family had made fishing tackle in that area for nearly 200 years, and he could easily become an officer. When people asked him why he had not opted for officer training and the prestige and the comforts that went along with that, he explained that he was quite happy as a sergeant. In fact, he had once given in to the temptation and started an officer's training course, but this ended abruptly when he wrote rude words on an intelligence test that he thought was a waste of time. Now, being a professor, I'm no stranger to students writing rude words on my tests, so I kind of get that, all right? So he's a guy who spoke his mind, and God bless him for doing that. When asked why he made a practice of swimming ashore on hostile beaches, he simply said that he liked it. It was not too bloodthirsty, and yet it was quite exciting. In short, he was one of those brave but eccentric soldiers. This is from an article that was written about him, who can be a great asset to an army if it does not have too many of them. A square peg who luckily found a square hole. He died in 1986 in Manchester in north central England, and I have corresponded with his granddaughter, Sam, or Samantha Gardner, and she shared various anecdotes with me. I'll just briefly mention a couple. One, this is from her email or her correspondence with me. She said, I've grown up with stories about my grandfather's exploits during the war, and we're all very proud of his part in it. He died when I was 10, and so I had some years to get to know him, although he didn't talk much about the war with me. He did, however, teach me how to sneak up on a sentry and make short work of him, which was much to my mother's horror when I was a tender age of 8 years old. Also, for those of us, some of us enjoy fishing. Some of my friends might be on here who are people I go fishing with. The Ogden Smiths had a fishing tackle business around St. James in London, and all three brothers, when they traveled, took travel fly fishing rods with them on their missions during the war, just in case they got an opportunity to fish. So we might go through some of these images. Let's go to the next one. This is actually a diorama that was a three-dimensional diorama. This appears in the collection of Bruce Ogden Smith memorabilia that was secured by businessman and philanthropist, British billionaire and member of the House of Parliament, Lord Michael Anthony Ashcroft. His staff made these available to me, and so this is actually a diorama showing Logan Scott Bowden and Bruce Ogden Smith, a kind of an aerial view on the top of one of these X-craft midget submarines, and they're coming in to download the soil samples that they got from this D-Day invasion in this particular image. Next slide, please. This is, again, the fishing tackle business. Bruce Ogden Smith, used that expertise to build this reel that they would use to get their gradients when they measured beach distances and gradients for their surveys for amphibious landings. They relied on that, and so here's some of his items, again, from the collection of Lord Michael Anthony Ashcroft. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Bruce Ogden Smith, again, from that same collection, showing all of the gear. I've written about this in the article, so I won't repeat it here, but these people did not swim. It was not a light swim, okay? They were fully encumbered with all kinds of things to ensure the success of, assuming they were strong swimmers, of course, to ensure the success of their operation. And then the next slide, please. This is Sergeant Ogden Smith's formal military photo made available by the auction house, Dix Noonan Webb, stayed auction house and for a few hundred years in Britain, and they were the ones who handled auction of some of his memorabilia, his war memorabilia that was recovered by Lord Michael Anthony Ashcroft. Next slide, please. And we'll go back one. So that's it. So anyway, these items that I've been showing you are on display in the Imperial War Museum in London, along with Distinguished Service Medals and other awards for gallantry by British servicemen and women and who served in that conflict. So that's a little bit about him. Thank you.
Those are incredible backstories. I found myself too. It's funny. It's my first name, even though I go by my middle name is Robert, and my daughter's name is Alexandra. So,
oh wow!
And my parents were married in 1950. And one last anecdote: I dearly love a good single malt Scotch whiskey. So
okay,
a few parallels, but very, very different than those two heroic men I've never been a very good swimmer, even though I grew up at the beach. So I can't imagine wearing that suit and with all the extra weight, and particularly when loaded up with soil samples.
Well,
So
I've never put on a suit like that, but I have had a little bit of experience with firefighter gear, and that's very heavy. And if you've ever put that on, you know how heavy that is. It is with all the gear those guys towed in. It's similar. It's a lot of stuff. But you don't have to carry a gun with you usually because people are shooting at you. That is the thing that you don't usually have to carry.
yeah,
They did.
very definitely. Plus, do all that in the dead of night, and
Right.
so on.
In the midst of winter.
Yeah, yeah. You did discuss both of those individuals at good length, and those, your extra discussion here really embellishes and fleshes out their background and life stories. Who else is there that you might single out to talk about?
Sure. So if you could go to the next image, I've mentioned him already. This is Nigel Clogstown Wilmot. He was the lieutenant commander and was the leader of the combined operations and beach pilotage parties, as I've mentioned. He has been described, some of the articles about him described him as a man of wisdom as well as valor, painstaking and attentive to detail, but who thrived on the adrenaline of risk. I think I was doing pretty good until I got thrived on the adrenaline of risk part. He's described in another book as being scholarly, leaning to erudite jokes, a bookman, the kind who liked to take notes on everything and leave absolutely nothing to chance. So I know a lot of geotechnical engineers, and I'd kind of put myself in that category, the detailed kind of guy. He was the one who realized that any type of invasion like this could flounder due to lack of information about the approaches to the landing beaches. And so he proposed and was given permission to carry out the covert reconnaissance. And it took quite a few years for people to kind of catch on that this was the way to go. But once it did, well, as they say, the rest is history. Special Forces was born. He was convinced that beach reconnaissance would eventually be accepted as necessary for amphibious landings. And so he began training naval personnel in beach reconnaissance and pilotage. They put a lot of thought, a tremendous investment in this. If you could show the next image, I just want to say, and this kind of brings it back to today, some of you may recognize this person, Admiral William McRaven, a Navy SEAL and retired four-star admiral from the U.S. Navy. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a safer world because of this man right here, Admiral William McRaven. And in his book, Sea Stories, Admiral McRaven makes special mention of the British ex-craft sailors. He didn't name Nigel Clogstown Wilmot by name, but that's who he was talking about. Those were the people that were involved in this. And so those people influenced him, who in turn, he's done some amazing things. I invite you to read his book, Sea Stories, and then if you get a chance to see him, shake his hand and say thank you for his service. The Navy SEAL and Admiral of the U.S. Navy. Next slide, please. Or let's see, wait a minute, what are we talking about now?
Well,
You were just going to come back and talk to me. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, for a brief period, even though these photos are excellent. Well, what'd you learn from your research that surprised you? I mean, the incredible stories you dug up.
Well, obviously there's the fundamental thing of that this is the geotechnical engineering thing. And again, I can't overemphasize how, every day as a practicing geotechnical engineer before I came to university where I teach geotechnical engineering now, but every day, when I worked as a consulting engineer, we would go and do this kind of stuff. And yet here it is in such an amazing way that was a surprise. And when I read that, I was like, son of a gun, look at that. It surprised me, the youth of these men and the level of responsibility they carried, the level of diligence and just what they were able to achieve. That is truly inspirational and amazing to me. 23, 24 years old. I know young men are capable of doing some great things, and well, this is an example of that. I think that the drama of the soil sampling operation, I mean, when you think about this swim that these men took, this was New Year's Eve in the dead of winter. Well, folks, we have some good news. You're going to get to go for a swim tonight. The bad news is it's it's New Year's Eve and it's the English Channel. Freezing conditions, stealth, cover of darkness, can't get caught, can't make a noise. The drama of this soil sampling operation never ceases to amaze me. The worldwide scope of inquiry, the cast of characters, as I've mentioned, the worldwide scope of inquiry from New Zealand to Washington, D.C., to the National Archives, to the Library of Congress, to British Victoria, British Columbia, to auction houses of London, to just people, and then, of course, the families, the beautiful, beautiful interactions I've had with the families of these two persons. Those have all been surprised, hoped for, certainly not expected. It was beautiful.
Yeah, I was also struck at, in what's discussed in your article, how the invasion planners used input not only from the soil sampling operation, but from an expert British race car driver and world record holder for land and water about beach sand, and Scott Bowden's observation that you mentioned to General Omar Bradley about watching a horse-drawn construction cart make its way up a hill from one of the beaches, and then use all of those pieces of information to make the decisions about the bearing capacity of beach sand that they were, going to be landing on. It must have been really, really intimidating to be questioned by all the officers, very high-ranking officers, as a 23-year-old major, even though if you're come from aristocratic background, I just can't imagine that, trying to think back from when I was 23. But that's wow, just interesting.
Exactly.
Are there any other anecdotes that popped
Well,
up?
I'll mention two. One about Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, and one about Major Logan Scott Bowden. So I've mentioned these men are heroes in the traditional sense of the term, and so this is an image of King George VI pinning a medal on a soldier, and this is what I wanted to say about Sergeant Ogden Smith when he was, notified that he was going to receive a medal for valor. Actually, the citation read, "In recognition of gallant, distinguished services in the field." He was awarded a military medal, and he was scheduled to receive that medal. His investiture by King George VI was scheduled for Buckingham Palace. His wife, Sylvia, and all his family made the trip to the palace to attend the ceremony. And so they're all there. And when the time came for the pinning of the medal, the awardee, Sergeant Ogden Smith, was not there. Like, he didn't show up. He was a no-show. And so they kind of, well, what's going on with this? Well, it turns out that he was once again en route to Normandy, but this time he was in the left-hand pilot boat assisting the U.S. 1st Division soldiers. It was D-Day, June 6, 1944. He was headed back. That's just cool. And so, King George didn't get to pin him at that time. The next slide, please. He did eventually receive his medals, his commendations. Again, this was from the collection of Lord Michael Anthony Ashcroft and the medals of Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith. Thank you. And then you had mentioned about the Logan Scott Bowden in his interview following their soil sampling operation. He was called to answer questions. You go to the next image, please. Regarding that meeting at St. James Square with all those generals and admirals, there were 12 total there. And incidentally, this is not that picture. I don't have an image of that, but this was kind of the idea of the room, or at least the vibe that I got of the way the room was described. In this case, you see General Omar Bradley standing in the left, and then next to him, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay standing next to him in the background, and then in the front, Eisenhower and Montgomery and others of the leadership. But this was kind of the idea. But imagine a dozen admirals and generals, and his words that were recorded as saying, "I'd never been confronted with such a galaxy before," of all the stars that were there. But he kept his wits about him, and he completed a hard hour of questioning, especially from General Omar Bradley, because, I mean, once they landed on the beach, then the war had to get from there up on top of the beach, up on top of the high ground, and then work its way in. So it was all about moving troops, and that was General Omar Bradley's focus. And so they had a very detailed conversation, close questioning about that. At the end of the meeting, Major Logan Scott Bowden commented to General Bradley that in addition to covert reconnaissance, which is what he'd been talking about, COPPIS other duties, including assisting assault troops with the landing. And he asked General Bradley if he might be able to be part of the invasion of the operation. And General Bradley replied, well, he would see what he could do. And so on D-Day, just like his friend and colleague, Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, on D-Day, Major Scott Bowden was also on his way across the English Channel to Normandy beaches. He was assigned to Naval Force O and took station at the head of the fleet in the right-hand pilot boat for the U.S. 29th Division, immediately in front of the landing craft carrying amphibious Sherman tanks. His task was to observe the first assault wave on Omaha Beach and then to report back. And then, of course, he took command once he got on shore himself after that. So the next slide, please. This is just a kind of a stock image of one of those draft horses in the cart. The thing that, it really kind of came down to this, Major Scott Bowden's observation that, well, if this heavily loaded cart with these kind of tires could make it up a slope and the soils would support that, then it could probably support a kind of a single axle gun carriage, and ultimately that was kind of a load test as geotechnical engineers would think about it. So they had the soil samples, they had their observations, they had their site reconnaissance, and then they had kind of these observations that ended up kind of turning the day for them. So thank you.
You mentioned, Bill, in your article, and I think, earlier in our discussion today, that you use the story or the background on this sampling in instruction in some of your geotechnical engineering courses. Could you give us a little more detail on how you present this, and what's the feedback from the students?
Sure.
Do they like it?
I'll say students of all ages love this story. The students I teach at university, the undergraduate students, they love this story. I do quite a bit of continuing education for engineer practitioners, and they do it. It's just absolutely captivating. And so when I teach the story, I actually have a copy of the Ambrose book in my hand, and also I have an image of the Saving Private Ryan poster. And I'll say, y'all have seen the film, most people have, Saving Private Ryan, and they know a little about D-Day. And I go into that and I set it up and I said, well, that actually happened, it was like what we would consider an engineered process, where they had to determine that the beach was capable to support the landing craft. That was a very important thing. And so I actually take out the book and turn to the page, which I have flagged right here. And I, 2 pages, about a page and a half actually. And I just read the story to them straight out of the book. And it's truly gratifying and endearing and effective in terms of really communicating to our students how significant these kinds of things do. In fact, when I close that little story, I remind my students what I expect of them as a professor, and I tell them that the projects they work on may not rise to the level such that the fate of the free world depends on their soil sampling work, but if it ever does, my job is to make sure they know what they're doing, and I do expect them to do the job that's before them, and I make that very clear. And it's cool. It's a really worthwhile thing. In fact, that was perhaps, I think, what so many experiences, so many encouraging comments were what motivated me to write up the article for the 6th International Conference of Case Histories, and which the GeoStrata article came out of that. So, yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. I know back when I was teaching, now and then I'd roll a little bit of history into my lectures, and sometimes I'd get some very strange looks from the students when I'd mention I was going to do that, but every single time I'd also get a lot of very good feedback about how much they appreciate it. So that's great that you're able to really, emphasize the importance of good soil sampling and being properly equipped.
That's right. That's right.
Well, we're getting close to wrapping things up in our question and answers. And is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, as you know, I have 3 more images to share. They're of the Normandy American Cemetery on the bluff overlooking Omaha Beach. And so the first one is an image from the Normandy American Cemetery. As many would know, among the thousands, there were over 150,000 soldiers who were transported across the English Channel to Normandy for D-Day, for this invasion, Allied casualties totaled more than 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing in that operation. And Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith and Major Logan Scott Bowden were two who had been there before the war. That most of the people that were going there had never been to those beaches before. These two had. In fact, they were really able to encourage and to kind of buck up and to explain and assist the people who were they were traveling with in those groups they were assigned to, because they had experience there and they could tell them this is what it's like, and they could explain that. The next image is a quote by General Mark W. Clark. As a soil engineer, I so appreciated his statement that the World War II was fought for a cause, not for a conquest, and that these cemeteries, like the Normandy American Cemetery, would be evidence of that. Here was our only conquest. All we asked was enough soil in which to bury our gallant dead. And there are about a little fewer than 10,000 soldiers buried at that particular cemetery. The final image is an image of the cemetery on the bluff overlooking Omaha Beach and the English Channel, honoring the troops who died in Europe during World War II. So it is a reminder for us to commemorate the men and women who died while in the military service of their country, which is what Memorial Day is all about, particularly those who died in battle or as a result of wounds sustained in battle. We remember these veterans who made the ultimate sacrifice and who lost their lives and could not come home, reflecting on their service and why we have the luxury and the freedom that we enjoy today. And so I certainly am thankful to these persons about whom we've been talking today, and in particular to the families of Major Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith, and to all the men and women of the military who will be seeing this. Either you're on it live stream now or perhaps watching it in recorded later on. But thank you, a heartfelt thank you, with my deepest gratitude to you. Thank you.
I think, Bill, that last image there of the cemetery, it's very, very fitting for a presentation related to Memorial Day. And for me personally, it brought back a very moving experience I had there when I visited the D-Day beaches in 1984 and actually visited the grave of a cousin who had served as a paratrooper and who was killed on D-Day. Anyway, let's see if there's, I haven't seen any questions come in. Let's check on that. That's because I hadn't opened up the chat, so we'll give that just a second to open up. So nothing yet. So okay, well, looks like we've really answered a lot. Is there anything else, Bill, that you'd like to add before we close up?
Well, I think I'm just reminded of the words of President Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. That we can't really add to anything that these people did, but we can rededicate ourselves to honorable, truthful, good living and good character, and we can do our best to make our country that is a country that's free and is good for people to live and work and love and raise families and do the things that we get to do. And I'm very grateful for that. So.
Oh, good. That's excellent closure, especially this week before Memorial Day. So one thing to mention, there will be some references if anybody is interested in some other things you might look at that are related to this article. We're going to post those with the YouTube video, and those will be listed there and include a variety of different sources, including by geotechnical engineers and our current ASCE president, Dr. Jean-Louis Briot, who happened to be Bill's master's research advisor. I want to thank you, Bill, thank our author and all of you who attended this special GeoStrata Extra session. It will be available in the Geo-Institute section of YouTube. If there's anything you'd like to hear again, or for colleagues that may not have been able to to sit in on this live session today. And I thank you again, and thank you for all that attended. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Brad.
This was fantastic. Thank you, Bill. Absolutely fascinating story. I think for me, that's a lot of it, obviously, is that there is a story woven through this article, but also it's so cool when civil engineering makes a real difference in people's lives. I think whether it's, you know, someone who's in a rural area cut off from society most of the time, and there's a bridge that connects them to the rest of the world. Certainly something like that is amazing. This impacted the lives of the entire Western Hemisphere, maybe the entire world, you could argue. So I think that makes this an absolutely incredible story. And I appreciate you doing this today and spending the time and the effort that you needed to do to put this together. I know it wasn't super simple. And Jeff, the same for you. That was an excellent interview. And I think our viewers really got a lot out of it today. So I will say happy Memorial Day again to everyone out there watching, and to all those who have someone serving or who have someone who has served in their family in the past, especially. If you liked what you saw, and I hope you did because you're here at the end, that's what I always say, click on subscribe and click get notifications. You will know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. We have another GeoStrata Extra coming up in just a couple of weeks. It'll be on June 15th. Look for information about that next week. We will be flooding your inboxes with that. Helpful, kind propaganda, as it were. Today, Jeff, Bill, thanks again for doing this. This really great story, and I'm going to go back and check part of this out once we get it posted into the archive. So thank you so much.